check your phone. Says it's going,
That shut off.
says it's going. You might wanna check, just check on your phone, but.
Yeah, it says in progress.
Yeah,
Is it a recording though? Because
Should
that
be.
shut off.
I'm just clicking on it.
Okay.
Yes, it's recording.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay.
I guess that one stays red on that, not low.
Yeah, I don't know why. All right.
There are 371 people who are not taking money out of the retirement system, and 356 people who are.
All right.
So we're getting.
Call the meeting to order, the West Warwick Pension Board,
People who are actually.
Monday, December 9th, 2019,
Is equal to the amount of people.
at 19:18 hours.
That's, you get very close to that tipping point.
Roll call?
Albert Heron.
Here.
Colleen Kay.
Here.
Ralph Solomon. Michelle Lombardi.
Yeah. That's not responsible.
Okay, we have a quorum. Due to a question regards to the agenda not being proper, we are going to table everything on the agenda except for the presentation from Nyhart. Could you come up?
Do a motion. Right.
Okay, just do it, yeah, let's do
I'd like to
it.
make a motion to table all items from tonight's agenda to the next meeting, except for the
H.
Item H, Nyhart presentation of actuarial report.
I second the motion.
Motion made and seconded to table everything on the agenda except for item H till the next meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Should I move this down a little bit?
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, goodness. All right, is that okay?
Yep.
All right. My name's Elizabeth Wiley. I'm an actuary with Nyhart, and I'll be walking us through the results of this year's valuation. Before I get started, are there any timing constraints I should be aware of? I'm not sure.
No, no.
Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and get started. I'm not gonna go through each page,
Okay.
but if you do have questions or if you see something, please feel free to stop me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'll just hop on over to the highlights page and just tell you in general what changed and what you can expect going forward, the high-level view. So as far as the results from this year, the big first result is the asset return for the year. Assets did not perform as expected. Assets only earned 4%, where we were expecting 7.5%. So that has an impact on your valuation results. That's gonna increase the cost that we had originally projected for this upcoming fiscal year for 2021. We had a minor update in your assumptions. We updated the mortality improvement scale, the rate at which we expect mortality to improve over time. We use a table based on Social Security improvements, so the same table used by the Social Security Administration. We take that information and use their information to come up with a scale, and that shows that people actually, that mortality isn't improving as much as they had thought, so that lowered your liabilities a little bit. Okay, we did have some demographic increases though, over what we expected as well, so that kind of balanced out. As far as the results for this year, the recommended contribution is about $10.5 million for 2021, where we had projected to be closer to $10.4 million. Your funded percentage did increase from 23.3% up to 24.5%. So, and that is largely due to the fact that the town is still continuing to make the recommended contribution. Payments are still going into the pension. Looking forward, what we're expecting is if you are able to continue to contribute at the recommended rate, expect the plan to be sustainable over the long term. I'll go through in a few pages here, what we're expecting over the next several years. Contributions are expected to increase based on how they are designed as a percent of pay, so as pay grows, so does your contribution. And lastly, we do have, mortality updates that are potentially coming here in the near future. Recently, the Society of Actuaries released an up-to-date mortality table. Right now, the town is using a relatively new table, the RP 2014 table, so that is a recent table, but it's based on the mortality of employees who work for private plans, essentially the GEs, those private corporate entities. The Society of Actuaries did a study on public plan employees specifically, and these tables are actually reflecting even longer lifetimes than the private tables, okay? So we are looking at that and monitoring that. When we run sensitivities on different kinds of plans, we see increases in liabilities between 1% and 3%. We're having a lot of auditors ask about these new mortality tables. They're still relatively new based on information around 2010. And we're anticipating potentially recommending these up-to-date tables here within the next 1 to 3 years. The town recently did an experience study, so it's still prudent to say, well, we just recently did this study on experience, and then you go and update an assumption like that. You can still potentially substantiate waiting a little bit longer to recognize those tables. But if they are the most appropriate assumption, then that may be a recommendation here in the upcoming years.
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
Go back up to the first one. The actual is 4.0 versus the expected of 7.5. What was contributing factors?
What were the contributing factors of the lower than expected return? That's really a question, I think, for the investment advisors.
Okay,
I will say, we are seeing lower returns over fiscal year ending 2019. So, and it will depend on your asset allocation too. I know that you are heavily invested in equity, so I don't know if it was related to how equities
Okay.
were doing.
all right,
You know, but again, that is mainly gonna be a question for your
Yeah.
investment advisor.
right, okay. Just to see what your thoughts was on that.
Yeah.
All right. And 10.5 million for a recommended contribution by the town for 2021. Okay, all right.
All right. We'll go ahead and jump over to the funded status for the year, page 4. All right. So looking at this page, the red bar are your liabilities. That light purplish periwinkle color is the market value of assets, and then the dark blue is what we call your plan assets. So in determining the funded status of the plan and the funded percentage that we certify to, that's reported to the state, we use your plan assets and compare those to your liabilities. Those plan assets are a smooth value of assets. So there was a poor return over 2019 that we're not immediately recognizing right away. We're gonna phase that in over 5 years, and that's what we've done each year prior to this, so that way you don't see your funded status hop up and down as much. It smooths out either your positive experience or negative experience over time. So your plan assets were $42 million, whereas what's actually sitting in the trust was $40.8 million. Okay, so if we look at the bottom of this page on the lower right-hand side, at 7/1/19, we show on a market value basis, the plan is 23.7% funded, but the funded percentage that we're certifying to is 24.5% funded, and it shows an improvement from the prior year, where we were at 23.3% funded. What we had originally projected was 24.6% funded at this point. Again, that asset return is driving that down a little bit.
When you say originally projected, was that based on the plan that said that we would be 60% funded by 2032?
Yes, that
Okay.
same projection that we do each year, what that had originally projected for at this point was 24.6, based on 7/1/2018 information. So we updated year to year. Moving on to the next page, this shows your recommended contribution as a percentage of payroll. Okay? So the two main components of your contribution are gonna be 2 items. What we call your normal cost, which is the cost of benefits being earned in the upcoming year by your employees, and an amortization of the unfunded liability. So that normal cost, the cost of benefits is 4.4%. That's what the employer is paying in the cost of benefits that are being earned in the upcoming year. The payoff of the unfunded liability is 54% of payroll, so it's the bulk of the payment for your recommended contribution. And that increased from last year to this year, again, because of those asset losses. Assets were about $1.1 million lower than what we were expecting. And that payoff occurs over a 25-year period. So in total, we show the $10.5 million recommended contribution, which is 60.9% of payroll, an increase from 59% of payroll from the previous year.
I guess I'm a little confused. That you said that payoff is over a 25-year period whenever we don't quite meet that 7.5% that we were projecting, right?
Any kind of difference from expectations, either on your assets or your liabilities, is paid off over a 25-year period. So back in 2014 was the first 25 years that started, so
Right.
they're about,
And then
18 years
and then we
remaining.
slide it, and then in 2015, we would slide it to another 25 years, and then, in other words, is that 25 years sliding each year if we don't make our,
sure, and then that's a great question. So how it basically works is, back in 2014 is when we started it, and there, we said, okay, how well-funded is the plan? And there was a certain amount that was the unfunded liability at the time, and that is being paid off over 25 years. And right now, there's 18 years remaining on that big payment from 2014. Since then, any kind of difference, any kind of change from there is then amortized over 25 years. So there's still a new 25-year amortization, but the biggest one is always gonna be that first one, because you're not going to have, you might have a 1% change from what we expected. So that 1% is gonna be a lot lower than the initial one.
so, so if I understand what you're saying, correct me, we're aiming for 60% funded in 2032,
Correct.
okay? In 2032, we are likely to hit that 60% funded, but we're probably gonna stay kind of flat for every year, because of every year that we don't make that 7.5% projection that we were aiming for.
If the plan continues to not be able to achieve the expected return, yes, that's gonna create challenges in being able to meet the 60% funded threshold. What we're showing in the funded projection, the funding cost projection, is if under the current plan you are unable to, if there are significant changes from what's expected based on where we're at today, then the plan slightly overfunds. What we're gonna show in the projection is you'll need to put in 101.6% of the ARC beginning in 2021 in order to get to 60% funded by 2032.
Yeah.
So we adjust for it. It does go both ways, so if you had a year where you got over the 7.5% return that was expected, then that's reduced a little bit. But in the projections that we show and that we report to you, we will disclose what kind of adjustments are gonna be made to what percentage of the ARC you need to contribute in order to be able to still meet that funding deadline, because that is the most important part right now.
Yeah, there was one that you showed last year, or your company showed last year, and you spread it out over that, and the figures was getting high to compensate for that. But, okay, all right.
Elaine, are you good with that? That 25 years is not sliding, like you said, like, I just wanna make sure that that's clear. Like in that first year, like in 2014, again, the plan was, we showed that it was like around 120 million underfunded, excuse me, something like that. And we set up sort of like I'll call it like a loan payment to pay that off over 25 years. That loan payment is still sort of existing and increases with the pay scale every year. So there's still that big, large payment.
Right.
And then that next year, we said, okay, we are scheduled to pay off almost all of the unfunded, but as Beth said, maybe assets didn't do as well, so they're created a little bit of a shortfall before what we're expected to pay off versus what we now actually need to pay off. And let's just call that a much smaller number, it's like $1 million. So we set up that $1 million to be paid off over 25 years. So you're setting up like a new 25-year loan each year, but you're keeping the existing ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're keeping the existing loans, which means that we should make 60% funded by 2032. You know, I mean, I'm concerned about this because this is the law.
Sure.
We have to try to make that, you know, but since we're still kind of paying off new 25-year loans, then that 60% is probably gonna stay somewhat flat for a while until we're able to, until the market does a lot better, or we're able to do a lot better in the market. Because the market's done pretty well, but we're not doing real great in the market, so.
I'm not sure what you mean by that 60% is gonna stay flat.
Well, because you're still paying off a loan, so every year, you're still paying off something, you know.
Because you're saying we still gotta, you're
Right,
doing
but
another
it's a
20,
much smaller amount every year, so like, here, let me show you. So, that number there, that 120 million, so that's like the, like I said, the loan or the unfunded liability that we set up in 2014, when we set up this 25-year amortization. And then every year thereafter, you can see the numbers are much smaller.
3.7, 3.2.
Because that was the difference in expectation versus what actually happened. So yes, the 60%, if you will, is sort of a, I don't know if I want to say like a moving target, because we're always going to have these pluses and minuses. I mean, you may have 3 years in a row where assets earn 15%, let's say, and we would set up, I'll say, negative loans each of those years. And so you would, in theory, project to get to 60% funded before 2032.
Yeah.
So it just, it balances out each and every year.
Sure.
well, but no necessarily,
But out of 5 years, we've only we've only had a surplus once. The other 4 out of 5 years, we've had to, we've had a balance, an outstanding balance that we've had to kind of set up this 25-year loan for.
Correct. That is correct. And so, oh, go ahead.
So, you know, see what the stock market says, right? The past performance is no prediction for the future, right?
Exactly.
And so, we can hope that we're gonna do better, or maybe we find another way to take action now.
I think part of it's the adjustment that Elizabeth mentioned about, instead of paying 100% of the ARC, it's now 101.6 or whatever the figure is.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In those 5 years since 2014 to today, the benchmark has been 7%. How many years did we reach that benchmark?
Only 1 year did we exceed it. 1 year, according to what his figures were, 1 year we exceeded it, 1 year we came pretty close, and like very, very
Why
close.
wouldn't we lower that assumption if we're never going to meet it? Because even your investment.
I gotta agree with you there.
Week said 2020 does not look too good for the stock market. They came here in front of this board and said 2020 does not look good for the stock market.
So, we may ask them, they've got a beautiful chart in here coming up, and we may ask them to give us an estimate on a 4.5% rate instead of the 6.5%, 7.5% rate that we're looking at.
I believe when
See where we
Clear,
stand.
when Clearbrook was here, I think that was either I or David asked that question, and he said, we've been, like, like 7.5, and we've been off of it just by a little bit. We've basically been meeting it, except for that 1 year. So, we'll have to see what their recommendation is gonna be.
According to his figures, we haven't.
Yeah.
We did 1 year, and we came extremely close, like very, very close,
Yep.
and 1 year we exceeded it, and the other 3 years we didn't.
We never reached that
And what's,
benchmark, correct?
Right.
right, and so what's,
So to reach it, why don't you just lower it so you have some expectation that you can meet that earmark? Because your investment is saying, look, we're doing the best we can, but we can't reach it. We reached it 1 year, and the stock market was crazy that year, and we did very well. But even with the stock market doing fairly well now, we can't reach that benchmark.
Right.
So why not lower it? Because it's a fantasy world. If for 5 years you only met it 1 year, and next year does not look, so now you're looking into the 6th year and not looking very pretty for the pension. So why not say, look, we're going to decrease that expectation so we have some realistic view that we may hit it.
I'll call them. The only thing I think that might be a concern is how that affects everything else. I'm assuming there's a domino effect somewhere, but I'm just not sure what
Yeah,
that
it
is.
affects
I
your
think it
work.
would just affect the op.
But right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I understand what you've got so far at this point, where it's shortfall in that chart you just showed us on your tablet there, the arc is adjusted to make up for the difference, correct?
Right, so if the expectation is ultimately changed and the town ultimately decides we can't achieve 7.5, we can get 7 or 6.5, or what have you.
Mhm.
Whatever interest rate is deemed appropriate based on how you're invested and what your investment advisors advise. What we would then need to do is adjust our calculations. Right now, when we discount all these future payments back to today, we're using 7.5%. That's what we expect your
Okay.
assets to earn.
Right.
If that doesn't occur, and we ultimately need to lower our assumption, lower interest rates mean higher liabilities.
Right.
Less discounting, so that increases your liability and increases your normal cost.
Okay.
So we need to take a look at that.
I'll give
At
Clearwater a
least that,
call.
we need, at least to get the figures and make sure that the town council understands what's going on, okay?
So, I'm sorry, you're saying you want us to look at?
No, I will, Clearwater's the one who does the
Right,
investments.
yeah, absolutely.
I'll
And I
see,
mean on the asset side.
I'm gonna talk to them and see what the realistic of it is, and if is it something that we're never gonna be able to do, or we can't, we're setting our goal too high, as he said, and if it needs to be readjusted. And if that's the case, then everything's gonna have to change, but probably in all fairness, it's a little bit more realistic, you know.
Yeah, and that's the goal of the assumptions, I mean,
Yeah.
mortality and asset return.
Well, we've got a nice chart on page 16 with 3 bars, so 6.5%, 7.5%, 8.5%. We need to have them do one for like 5%, see what happens.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
All right.
Mhm.
I'm actually gonna go ahead and skip a couple pages, unless if you read these pages and have any questions, please let me know.
Well, I just want to ask a question on page 7.
Sure.
Make sure that we understand here. On July 1, 2019, we had 321 employees contributing to the plan, right?
Yes.
50 people who were just not contributing and not taking from the plan, they're just vested, right?
Correct. They're
Deferred.
either invested.
They're deferred.
Yeah, deferred.
Deferred. So that's 50 people the money's just sitting there. Nothing's going in and nothing's coming out. And 356 was people that were withdrawing from the plan. Is that correct? 297 plus 59 is 356.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I got 371 people not taking from the plan, and 356 people who are taking from the plan. Okay.
So if you look there, you definitely have a growing retiree population,
Mhm.
especially relative to your active employees. And as you were sort of indicating right now, fewer actives means less contributions coming in from them, which is certainly a measure of the level of riskiness of your pension plan.
Okay.
Right. On page 8, this just shows the annual benefit payments. In red, we show what was actually paid out of the plan, and in blue is what we are projecting. In the past few years, you would have seen a hop up. Now we are back to the time period where COLAs are restored.
Right.
So everybody's now receiving their COLAs going forward. I should say, those who had a COLA freeze
Right.
now have their COLAs restored. Depending on when you were hired, there's different kinds of delays that now apply for different groups. On page 9, we're showing your accrued liability by status, and this goes back to the demographics that you'd pointed out. In red is the liability associated with people in payment status, your retirees and beneficiaries, and then in the periwinkle are your disabled people. The yellow is your deferreds, and the actives are in that dark blue. So you can see that about 72% of the plan's liability is for participants who are no longer working for the town. The next page I'll just touch on briefly. This is the cost of benefits being earned in the upcoming year. So when an employee earns an accrual in a pension, what's the value of that as a percentage of their pay? In total, the value of the benefits that they're earning is 15.7% of their pay on average. The employees pay 11.3% of that, and the town pays 4.4% of that.
It's actually going down.
I beg your pardon?
It's, each year goes down.
Correct. As you have new employees coming in with less generous benefits
Yeah.
than the people they're replacing, that continues to go down. Page 11 shows the asset reconciliation from 2018 to 2019. The dark red is on your market value basis. The dark blue is your actuarial value of assets. On the right-hand side, where it shows investment return, on a market value basis, the plan earned $1.8 million. That was $1.4 million less than what we were expecting for the year. Now, we're phasing that in over time, so on an actuarial basis, it looked like the plan had a $2.1 million return for the year. And that negative return will continue to, essentially, if everything else happens as expected, that'll weigh you down a little bit over time until it's fully recognized. On page 12, this summarizes the investment return that the town has had historically. I think you mentioned that the 7.5%, what we are showing here is, that was only achieved in 2016, 2017, fallen short within the last 5 years. If we look over the past 10 years, since 2008, when the market essentially crashed, on average, the plan assets have earned about 7%, 6.9%, to be a bit more precise with that. As you mentioned, past performance is not necessarily indicative of future performance, but this is just how the assets have performed since 2008. I'm going to move on actually to the projections on page 14 and 15. So just as a reminder, these are projections based on our assumptions that we were just discussing. So these projections show that we are measuring liabilities at 7.5%. That mortality is at those RP 2014 rates, not the new Pub 2010, what we call the Pub 2010 rates, those new public mortality tables. That people retire as we expect, all of that. And so these projections are good for planning purposes, but are not a guarantee of future results. Just bear that in mind as you're looking at them. This is for planning purposes.
When you talk about the tables there, I believe I had a phone conversation with you sometime back with Tracy one night. And I did some paperwork to tell you which tables we were going to use assigned on that. If we used, if I remember, can't remember all exactly how you explained it all, but if we used the newer table, is that, it seems like that's going to be beneficial to the plan?
If you were to use the newer table,
Right.
beneficial, if you were to adopt the new Pub 2010 tables, those would result in an increase in your liabilities.
Yeah.
So it'd be, like, as I mentioned, between 1% and 3% higher. We haven't done the study specific to your plan. But
Right.
your liabilities and your normal cost would increase, meaning the ARC would increase if we were to adopt these new tables. And we've had auditors asking about these new tables that are still relatively new. It may be appropriate for us to update these mortality tables here in the future. We didn't make that recommendation yet necessarily this year.
No, not at the time, right.
Right, but it may be a recommendation here in the coming years as we review them further, as there's more discussion.
It does bring the liability up, but doesn't it also make the rest of it a little more accurate and more fair to the plan?
So if participants are living longer, then yes, this is ultimately better as a measurement of what you're actually ultimately going to pay out of the plan. You know, the ARC is really just what is recommended based on what we predict to be paid out from the plan. So the closer that we are to expectations, the better that we can predict what you're actually gonna pay out, and the better prepared you will be when those benefits ultimately come due. So if people are actually living longer than what we are expecting,
That's
then we wanna
increase
make sure
your
we're
liability.
measuring that and
Yeah.
valuing that appropriately.
I was just thinking though, I mean, I understand the liability goes up and that, but it's, and if you don't adopt it, that's, I just don't think it's fair to the plan, but, people living longer, yeah, that's nothing we have control over, but, we need to know that and get a more accurate table so that other things can be done to adjust and try and keep the plan to reach our goal, of what we're looking for.
And if you would like to see those tables specifically applied to your plan, that is something that we have the table, we can model that for the town.
Just as, or just for like an example, fee with that, I'm assuming, costs, right? All right, I'm just thinking out loud here, that's all, I just wanna, okay.
Alright, page 16 shows this long-term projection over the next 30 years. And we are doing this projection based on what we describe in what we call your FIP, your Funding Improvement Plan, which is the plan to get to 60% funded by 2032 as required by the state. So in blue is the recommended contribution if plan assets only earn 6.5%. We're still measuring your liabilities at 7.5%, but assets are earning 6.5% in this projection. The black bar is what we are expecting based on the baseline, a 7.5% return. And then the red bar is what the town would ultimately pay if assets earned 8.5% every year over the long term. Okay, so you can see that the recommended contribution continues to rise as a dollar amount because it's intended to be paid off as a flat percentage of payroll, and your payroll is expected to grow at 3.5% per year until it caps off there around 2040 and ultimately dives back down to what we call the normal cost. So out in 2040, you've paid off your unfunded liability, you're 100% funded, and then your cost just drops to what employees are earning each year going forward. Okay? What this projection, oh sorry.
Go ahead.
What this projection is also assuming is that the town is making a contribution slightly over what the recommended contribution is in the valuation report.
House like,
101.6% of it, so 1.6% higher in the figure. Okay. And that's what's necessary each year going forward to get to 60% funded by 2032.
so that's starting with the next fiscal year.
Correct, yep. Now, last year when we showed that projection, what we'd shown was 100.3% of the ARC, 0.3% higher than what the ARC was. Okay, so we adjust that percentage each year based on making sure you get to 60% funded.
Right,
So in 2022, if we have any kind of difference from expectation, then that will be accounted for when we do the cost projection.
right,
So if you
okay.
have better experience than expected,
Yeah,
that'll drop that back down.
yeah, I saw a similar table that you had done, I don't know if it was when we were in the manager's office for that meeting, but yeah, and it was climbing quite a bit per year, right.
So, you had mentioned that our 10-year return was 6.9%. And I just did a quick calculation, and our 5-year return was 5.4%. So I think it might be a good idea for us and the town council to know what this projection would look like if the return was 5.4%. Okay?
But that's something, I mean, that's certainly something that we can show. That's certainly something
I
that we
just
can
wanna see
model.
it.
Yeah.
Right, just add it to the table and see what happens.
You know, do something as close to what it actually is,
Well, that's
or as
what it
close
is
as possible.
right
yeah.
now. I mean,
Yeah.
so,
Alright. And that's actually all the material that I have here in front of you. I know when we sent over the reports have a little bit more detail, the actuarial evaluation, and then the more detailed funding improvement plan petition. Yeah, yeah. So, if you have questions on that, happy to answer anything regarding those or this presentation.
The divisions are very predictable.
Just have one comment to
Sure.
add, if that's all right.
Sure.
In general, I think our job is to help make you aware of, I'll say, the risk of a pension plan, and along with that, help provide a best estimate for liabilities as of today and the funding recommendation to keep the plan sustainable in the long term. So we've mentioned a couple key assumptions. The two real key assumptions in any pension plan are the, I'll call it the discount rate or the expected return on assets and your mortality assumption. And, Albert, to your point, I think like using the new mortality table, if that's ultimately the best representation or best expectation for the lives of the plan, then that's what, we would recommend. And like you said, I think it can increase the liabilities, but the point is to have the best representation of liabilities and the recommendation for the plan. And same with like the expected return on assets. I think Elizabeth mentioned it earlier. That really stems from your asset allocation. And let's say you're invested, or all of your money's in just cash, and like a CD, whatever, earning 1%.
Yeah.
We would say you should use 1% through discount rates, because we know what the return's gonna be. And opposite of that, you're all in equities, it's sort of whatever your asset advisor is saying. But, regarding the assumptions though, we are, I don't know, it's maybe relatively neutral as far as whether you would lower your discount rate or not, let's say, as long as it's following what your asset allocation is, which your asset advisor is suggesting you would be able to earn. So, let's say your asset advisor suggests you can only earn 5.4%, then we would find that a reasonable assumption to use. And that would, since we don't get to talk in front of you too often, I wanna make sure that's clear. And again, it doesn't matter to us, but that would increase the liabilities, and that would make it a lot harder to reach 60% funded by 2032. Now, I don't say that to suggest you shouldn't do it in any way, shape, or form. Again, because if that's the best assumption to use, I just want to make sure that that is a significant impact of lowering that discount rate.
Right.
Because liabilities would go up quite a bit.
Right.
Again,
And we,
by no means am I
You know
saying don't
something?
do that.
here's the thing, bad news never gets better with age.
Yeah, sure.
So, we need to show the council, here's the worst case.
Yeah.
You know,
And
you
realistic.
got the 8.5%, that's the best case, that's a weird, well, I don't know if we'll ever see that, but.
Sure, absolutely.
But we need to show them the worst case, and in fact, right now, we are living that worst case.
Yeah.
So,
And with the assumptions, like I said, you want a realistic set of assumptions in
Yeah.
there. And if the asset advisor thinks you can only get 5.4, then that's what one would use. Otherwise, maybe your point you're saying, but you sort of got an unrealistic expectation out there, and you're never going to meet it each year, and then you're always short, and then we can sort of look at that. But anyway, just wanted to make sure that we sort of spoke those assumptions a little bit. But we can certainly work directly with the asset advisor, or have information passed to us from the folks as well.
Another question. If they did decrease their expectation, so let's say 5.5% from 7, that
It's at 7.5 now.
that required recommendation for the ARC would rise significantly, right?
Yes.
So we all agree with that. So if we can't meet 7, and the expectation is maybe 5, 5.5, if the market does good and our investment firm does very well, and what they get paid for, they come at 5.5, that's our only expectation for the future, then the town and the pension board should have that right to know, saying, look, the taxpayers are gonna be on the hook, not for $10.5 million. It could be up to the, and I don't know how to run,
Yeah.
you're the accountants, and it could be up to like $11, $12 million, correct? If you're lowering it from 7 to 5.9. That ARC would grow significantly.
It would not be a small.
It wouldn't be a small.
Correct.
So we're keeping it at 7 to keep it mainly at a nice flow.
It's 7.5. just-
7.5. So we're keeping it at a nice flow, so the town isn't shocked. The town residents aren't shocked by a $13 million and tax increases and all that. So we're keeping it relatively calm at 7 point, even though we're not reaching it. We're keeping it at a calm 7.5%. So nobody gets flustered, right? I mean, that's, isn't that what we're doing?
Well,
basically?
Well-
to some extent.
If we can't
but,
reach
you know,
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
unreasonable. It's unreasonable.
Our investment advisor at one point did come in and say, 7.5% might be too much, we can probably do this, 7 we could probably meet. And that,
What have you?
I think was based on, the investment profile from 2008 up to 2014-15. But,
Right,
since
but
then,
you
it
have
hasn't
them
done
here
it that
tonight,
well.
and they're saying, and you had your investment advisors here,
They said
last year,
2020 was gonna be
said,
not good.
2020 doesn't look good,
Right.
people. So for 5 years, we haven't reached 7.5%.
Right.
For 1 year,
Right.
so we're living in a dream world, right? I'm not the only one, I'm not a financial wizard, I'm a cop, okay? I have no financial background at all,
Mhm.
but I think we're just, and I hate to use the word lying to the taxpayers and the council. I think we're over-exaggerating our position, because we only have 20-some million dollars to invest. If we had $90 million to invest, we'd be in a different ballgame. But we only have 26 million, whatever it is, a small amount of the pie to invest in this market, where we're only seeing for 5 years, one year, just 1 year, of 7.7. So I think it would be realistically, I don't know how much they would charge you to say, hey, what would the recommended contribution be if we take it down to a reasonable number? Maybe you can meet 6, maybe not, but at least bring it down to a scale where it's reasonable and everybody can say, hey, there's a possibility we can reach 6, because I don't think there's a possibility we're gonna reach 7.7. That's my,
So- So that's exactly that's sort of what I asked, when they take a look at, on the chart on page 16, if they would add one more line to that chart for a 5.4% return, just to see, because that's what we've been earning for the last 5 years, just to see what the impact would be. And to give the town council some good information.
yeah, they have the right to know.
Absolutely.
And people do.
Well, if they're gonna charge more for it, just change the 6.5 to 5.5. If they're gonna if they're gonna charge extra to put another calculation in there, just,
I'm sure it won't be a lot of money to run that calculation.
shouldn't be.
If we,
I mean, to change it from like to 6.5, 5.5, there's 2 distinct things one can do there. We are measuring the liabilities at 7.5%, which means your liabilities are 170 million, I think. If we keep measuring the liabilities at 7.5, but change the return to 5.5, we're sort of, that's one thing, versus changing how we measure the liabilities to 5.5, and then assuming it happens at 5.5. You'll get a very different picture. If we keep measuring the liabilities already at 7.5, and just to your point, Michelle, replace the 6.5 with 5.5, that's not a time-consuming thing for us to do. But if we were to remeasure the liabilities at 5.5 or 5.4, that is a different sort of study, different analysis. That is a little more time. And they're very different pictures there. I mean, one of them, like you said, is you're sort of lying to yourself and saying, oh, we think we're gonna get 7.5, but we get 5.5 forever. What's the result of that?
and going down that road, that liability is growing, and to add insult to injury, the return is less than the 7.5, so the arc has to go up. All right. If we use a different table, bring expectation rate percentage down, we come a little more accurate and a little more reasonable, but it's a picture that's not as pretty as what it was. The liability, the ARC figure, as he said, goes up, I'm gonna say exponentially, it's gonna go up quite a bit. But my original question and what my thinking was, if we try and change, if the table makes, as you just got done saying, makes a better picture, and it might change the figures different, we won't know until you figure it all out. But it'd be a little more accurate. The ARC's gonna keep going up. When I looked at that chart, and I think I talked to you, like I said, on the phone, they're gonna have trouble meeting it as it is now. I don't see how they're gonna do it down the road. So, I'm just wondering if it's to get it as more accurate as possible, more realistic, adjusting things to what our actual returns are. Because if we do that and we adjust that, then we've got a better picture of where everybody stands. The council stands, the taxpayer stands, and us as the retirees, and then the system, how it's doing.
And current employees.
And existing ones, right, because now when you have to change something to them or whatever, they get a little more accurate information. But that's gonna be a huge increase that they're gonna have to absorb somehow. So, I kinda see what you're saying. It's kinda like lying, but basically you aren't giving them an accurate representation of what's going on.
It's distorted.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, as far as, the comment on, I guess, reasonability, one thing I will mention when it comes to the mortality, we are still using a mortality table that is pretty up to date. And
Yeah.
again, as I mentioned, we had that experience study recently, so we are reviewing your experience each year to make sure it's still reasonable, so, so we hear that word, if we hear unreasonable, that's a scary word for an actuary, because we certainly prefer to be reasonable rather than unreasonable, but we are continuing to monitor it, so I don't want you to think that you're necessarily at an unreasonable spot with your assumptions.
How,
We would certainly indicate to you so, and that's why we're discussing the Pub 2010 tables now, is this might be a more reasonable assumption for you going forward. We talk about things like the investment return, to give you information as far as how you're doing. So I don't want you to think that we're using a mortality table that's egregiously wrong or something like that. I just wanted to make that comment.
how often do you monitor that? You say,
Each year we come up with what we expect for your liabilities versus what actually occurred. And we do these comparisons and we say, okay, every year we're gonna be different, because that's how assumptions work. We don't assume the whole person passes away, we assume pieces of people pass away. So we review each year to make sure that our assumptions are in line with expectations. And if we're off, we need to explain why we are off, so.
the existing mortality table that we're using is fairly accurate, you're saying?
So the current mortality table that you're using is very up to date. Based on what we saw for this year, there was a slight mortality loss because people were living slightly longer than what we expected. Last year, we saw mortality gains because more people passed away than expected. So it's because of the size of your population, you don't have thousands of people in your pension plan. You have about 370 people in your pension plan. So that is something where we have to look at it over a period of time to say, okay, in general, how are we doing? Because each year could be kind of skewed, but we do look at that each year to see how close we are to expectations, and then we do that experience study, which is required every 3 years. Say, okay, we now have a new period of time to look at how are we doing with our expectations.
Okay.
Anybody else? I think we've got it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Um, Anyone else have questions?
We'll take questions from the audience.
Questions?
I just have one more
Sure.
question, if you don't mind. And I know Nate's not here anymore, and we had a discussion before. The administrative costs are figured into the ARC, correct? Like, administrative costs?
Like our fees that you're talking about?
Everybody's fees, the lawyer's fees, Tracy's fees, everybody's fees. They're figured into the ARC. Am I correct?
So,
When you do your recommended contribution, did you use all the money that the pension board has spent other than paying out benefits?
sure, we do not add an additional cost onto your ARC to assume for administrative expenses, but the return that we show and the return we're showing is net of those expenses. That makes sense.
That that's from everybody's, money that's put in, including the employees, or you just do that assumption on the town's money that they put into the pension to assume the pension costs? Or
So,
do you clump everything together, employee contributions and the town's contributions, and then you decide what that arc would be? Or is it just, well, the town paid $6 million or $11 million in, and their part of the administrative cost was $200,000. So that's figured into the town's contribution part. Or is that all figured in together with what the employees put into the system too? Because I don't think it's fair that an employee should be paying for the administrative costs. You know what I mean? For a benefit they're deriving out of their pension system. See what I'm saying? We pay money out of our paycheck every week
Sure,
to go into a pension for benefits.
sure.
Okay, we don't pay money into the pension system to pay out costs for whatever this board decides to spend on.
Yeah, I think that,
But they told me that was all figured in.
I think that's split, if you will. I mean, that's really more like a governmental type question. What I mean by that is either someone has to pay the fees to the investment advisor, us and the lawyers, if you will, and whether I'm gonna say the government, the town decides that the town will pay it or that the pension plan is gonna pay it. That's sort of a decision for the town, if you will. And as far as whether it's accounted for, that return that we talked about, the 7.5, if you will.
Would it surprise you if I told you, and I don't know if you have a copy of all the contracts, I'm sure you do, for the municipal police and fire, that it says in the pension plan that the town will assume responsibility for administrative costs. The town of West Warwick, not the pension plan, the town of West Warwick. That's what it's always said in the contracts. Because we put that in for a reason. And the reason why we put that in there, because we didn't want the town paying money out of our pension system for frivolous things. You know, suppose they wanted 7 lawyers, suppose they wanted 6 clerks, suppose they all wanted iPads, suppose they all wanted iPhones, okay? Just paid out the pension system. We said, no. If you wanna give them all iPads, you wanna give them all iPhones, you wanna give them all computers, you wanna give them 7 lawyers, you wanna give them 4 clerks, you pay for it. The town will pay for that. Because now, if the finance director got a hold of that and said, oh my God, they all want computers, I'm not paying for computers. They all want iPhones, well, that's technology now. You're not getting iPhones, we're not paying for that. But in the infinite wisdom down the road, they told me that it all washes out. That's what I've been told for the past 10 years. It all washes out, Mr. O'Connell, administrative cost, whether it's paid out of the pension fund or it's paid by the town of West Warwick through its finance. It doesn't make any sense.
Your ARC contribution recommendations are based on the liability and what the returns are for the following fiscal year, correct? Is that what you're saying?
So the recommended contribution is just a payoff of the unfunded liability and the cost of benefits being earned in the upcoming year.
And as the liabilities increase, that ARC's gonna increase. But you don't receive any, the expenses or anything that's used to administer the plan? You don't figure that in, you have no knowledge of what that is?
Does the town finance director send you any invoices as to saying, okay, our administrative costs were $289,000 this year, so figure that into our,
We have the expenses for the past year that were reported to us. I don't know on what, I don't know what level of detail that it is, but we certainly have the total from like what's classified as investment expenses versus administrative expenses, for instance. And when we calculate that return, we've used the number, I think, 4%, right? That the return was 4%. And that is accounting for the fact that expenses were paid out of the trust versus if we said the return with another calculation was 4.6%, which would be that the expenses were not paid out of the trust, right? But that's not, the measure we use is that the expenses are coming out of the trust. The expenses are coming out of the pension assets.
but if you don't know what those expenses some of them are legal expenses
Sure.
that need to come out of the pension. Investments, your fees
Sure.
should come out of the fund, okay? But anything administrative, paper clips, computers, secretaries, lawyers, anything that doesn't have to do with investment for the employees, for them to get a benefit, that's not contributing to the employees. A lawyer, secretary, nothing against you and you, Krista, but this has been a pet peeve of mine over the years. Because when I was on the board, I used to sit up there. We never paid for administrative costs because it said in the contract that they would be assumed by the town. And the town, if I had a question for a lawyer, I'd send the town the bill, finance director. I wouldn't send it to the actuary who was billing it. I would send it to the town finance, say, hey, we got a lawyer question here. I want you to pay for it. I want you to give me an answer, and here's the bill for it. And it would come out of town finance. Our secretary, she would get paid by the finance function. So what I'm saying is, and if we weren't in critical status, I'd let this thing fly out the window. But we are in critical status, and we've been in critical status for many years now. It just doesn't make any sense if you people don't know what you're paying out of administrative expenses. That's just coming off the bottom line.
Sure, so I wanna make one very important clarifying point here, is that we don't authorize any payments coming out of the trust whatsoever from an administrative expenses standpoint or an investment expenses standpoint.
Right.
And for this plan and every other plan that we work with, we have no authorization to do that, and nor is it our, I'll say, responsibility to do that. You know, if the expenses that have been reported to us, it is not our, from an actuary's perspective, again, this is not just us, this is, I mean, you could ask us to do it, you could ask us to audit the expenses, but that is not the current arrangement, and it's not for any plan we work with. So, no, I could not tell you, like, itemize what is coming out from an expenses standpoint, but that's the, that's the purview of really, I'll say, the town and or the pension board to figure out what expenses come out of the trust. I know Tracy always asks me about, like, our fees and stuff, so I assume she does that with everything else. But
Yes.
But what is being paid for out of the trust assets is not something we have any knowledge of, other than the total that gets told us at the end of the year. And then on that total, if it were to ever look out of line from year to year, we would ask a question to see if there was some additional expense, but we do not know the exact item. Like, to your point, if paper clips were paid out, we do not
Right.
know.
So you wouldn't get a bill from the finance department saying that we paid $30,000 to a secretary, or $170,000 to a lawyer. You wouldn't have that info as to determine what the op would be for the next fiscal year.
Correct, we just have the total expenses that were paid.
Right, you just have a lump
Administrative
sum.
and invested, and to your point, I mean, like private pension plans, or ones that are, when I say private, I guess I mean, just corporations, whatever.
Mhm.
They're not allowed to pay, the only time money can come out of the trust, if you will, or pension assets, we'll call them trust, whatever, is for, to your point, the benefit of the participants, is either to pay benefits directly to the participants, or it's for, I'll say services or things that are needed to keep the pension plan ongoing, if you will, such as evaluation reports as well.
Correct.
So,
So you would be very shocked if I told you that when the pension plan was set up, it would say in the original document that the only thing that come out of this pension plan are for the benefits of its employees.
no, I would not be shocked by that.
Okay, because it's more like a private pension plan, right?
Yeah,
We probably,
that's pretty normal, and I don't know all the public plan laws around the
Right.
state or the country, but, I mean, that wouldn't surprise you, that's sort of a very normal thing to do, I mean, that's.
to be incorporated in there, right? Because it would just be, you want to pay benefits to your employees, people that work for the town, that put money into the town, into the pension system, correct?
Correct.
So, what I'm telling you, that's what the unions thought when we originally did this, and that's why it's in contracts today. And for you not to, and Nate gave me a great story saying that it was a great story that everything was done as an assumption, all administrative costs were lumped together, and that was determining the op. If you don't know what the costs are, then you could never put it in the R, because you don't know what the actual costs are.
We know what they are.
Just what the town reports to you.
Historically, yeah,
Correct.
that's correct. I mean,
You only do what the town tells you to do, correct?
correct. Yeah, we
You
do
don't
not,
make any assumptions on your own.
we do not audit assets and or what comes out of the assets. We audit we audit the benefit payments pretty well because that falls under, what I would say would be we should be paying attention to what benefits are coming out. I mean.
So you
if-
audit
if-
everybody that gets a pension out of the system?
Say that again?
You audit everybody that,
If we're told at the beginning of the year that there's 100 retirees, or when we first took this plan over, we received data from Milliman and November, and we were told, and I'm making up numbers now, but we were told that there are 100 retirees and they're getting X amount per month. I mean, we would review that at the end of that year to say, okay, did everyone get 12 payments, whatever that math added up to? And for those that didn't match expectations, we asked questions because maybe someone died and the beneficiary took over, or whatever. So, I mean, we review those benefit payments to make sure that they're reasonable. I don't know the level of detail that we get on that off the top of my head, but I know we look at the benefit payments, and at the beginning of the year, we have some expectations for what would be paid to those that we know of are as
as
retirees,
retirees.
and then, et cetera.
Good, thank you.
The expenses that you get from Tracy, what do you do with them?
We don't get any
I don't
expenses.
send them
No,
any
you-
expenses.
I do have a question. I'm just kind of wondering, like, how do you get paid? What is it determined by? Like, how is NIHOP paid? A percentage?
Like how much? Or
Yeah, well, how much, and then
Sure.
what factors are used to consider your payment?
The second part, I'm a little fuzzy on what exactly you mean, but on the first
So
part,
how-
I mean, it's a contract that, I don't know, at the beginning of, when we first started services, we said, here, we propose X dollars to do the valuation and the GASB accounting. Those are our fees, but the second part, I'm just not quite sure what you mean.
No, I'm just wondering what how do you determine the fees? And we are not still in contract, are we?
We're not still in contract.
Contract? We're not under contract at this point, right?
I'd have to double check off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But as far as like what we determine, I mean, it's just based on what we think is gonna take us some time to spend and produce the reports and the information and the GASBs and the reconciling the data and conversations back and forth about making sure we have the correct data, et cetera. That's what goes into determining the fees.
So for
Time spent-
2019,
Time spent on it.
okay, so 2019 thus far, do you know how much you were paid by us?
In 2019, I could try and look it up. I don't have it with me. I'd have to see if I can log into my computer back in Indianapolis, but I do not know off the top of my head what we paid in 2019.
Because I would like to know.
Yeah.
And what it's based on, I mean, percentage.
I mean, it's based on just the time spent.
So,
It's not based on assets.
yeah. Time spent, so you have an hourly charge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can tell that from their bill, from this month. This one's bill, you can see what they do. A couple of things are like a flat rate charge, like when they calculate somebody's retirement pay, that's a flat rate, but a couple of things are hourly.
Okay.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay.
Let's see what he comes up with.
just the valuation services, so the valuation reports, the funded percentage, the liability measurement, the contribution recommendation, et cetera. And there's been some for benefits, almost 7,000 for benefits, and that varies, it goes up and down from year to year, right? I mean, if one person asks for, or retires, then we do one, if we do 30 people retire, we do 30, so that number varies.
Anything else? No.
I'm sorry,
No. But that's it? That's all you have?
Yeah, for us, I was just, sorry, the only reason I was on my computer, just to
No other
to
questions,
look up
Michelle?
those fees
No,
for
no.
Michelle there.
No, thank you.
Any questions? Anyone else have a question? Okay, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since all further business is tabled, I make a motion that we close this meeting,
Adjourn.
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 Second motion.
Motion made and seconded to adjourn regular meeting